Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn on Equitable Public Engagement. I'm Danielle Render. I'm the Director of External Engagement and Public Affairs here at NOACA, or the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency. We are pleased to offer this series of discussions on topics of interest to our planners and engineers and to all of you, our public at large. And for this year's series, we're focusing on issues related to our long-range plan, ENEAL 2050, an equitable future for Northeast Ohio. This framework will set the agenda for all forms of transportation in the region, including automobile, bridge and roadway, transit, bicycle, walking, and the movement of freight. The plan will also examine the region's land use patterns, environmental concerns, and income disadvantage in sensitive areas within the goal of identifying better access to employment and housing, healthcare, and even economic development within our region. Today's discussion on equitable public engagement is especially important given the long-range plan's focus on an equitable future for Northeast Ohio. So there's been much discussion in our country lately around the concept of equity. So this is a critical time where an equity lens needs to accompany the development of the long-range plan. And NOACA has always been aware of past inequities in planning, and we're committed to addressing this issue. Our board of directors just recently adopted a statement on our commitment to racial equity in planning. And so please visit our website to read the full statement in its entirety. And consistent with NOACA's guiding mission and values, we are also committed to doing our part to eradicate racism and fully address how we develop a long-range plan for an equitable future. So today's topic centers on how taking an equitable, inclusive community engagement approach helps to ensure that the people most affected by a transportation project have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. It is especially important to engage those who have been historically left out of these conversations, such as low-income people, minorities, communities of color, recent immigrants, and speakers of English as a second language. But the big question is, how do we do that? So our panelists today in this session will tell you as they discuss how being aware and accepting of cultural differences can improve the planning process and make projects run more smoothly. So we look forward to this discussion, and thank you again for joining us today. Now I'll turn the program over to our host, Gail Godek, who is the Senior Communication Specialist here at NOACA, who will also introduce today's panelists.
Unmute, Gail.
Okay, thank you, Danielle, and thank you to everyone for joining us today for today's Lunch and Learn on equitable public engagement. We're delighted to welcome our guest speakers, Nelson Beckford, Jejuana Brown, Nicholas Gorris, Joyce Huang, and Richard Huang. Let me tell you a little bit about each one. Nelson Beckford is the Program Director for Neighborhood Revitalization and Engagement at the Cleveland Foundation. He joined the foundation in January 2018 after spending 4 years at St. Luke's Foundation, where he served as Senior Program Officer for a Strong Neighborhood. In that role, Nelson oversaw the Strong Neighborhood program with the goal of making enhancements to the built environment and improving social conditions in the Buckeye Shaker, Mount Pleasant, and Woodland Hills neighborhoods. Before that, Nelson served as program officer for the Cleveland Foundation's responsive grant making, focusing on community development, environmental sustainability, and program management of the summer internship program. He has also worked for the Detroit Shoreway Community Development Organization, University Hospitals Health System, Cole Managed Vision, and the American Red Cross. Nelson also served with the U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division, which is the light infantry. He has a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in psychology from Cleveland State University. So welcome, Nelson. Our next panelist is Jejuana Brown, and she is the Director of Equity and Inclusion Programs at the Greater Cleveland Partnership. She is responsible for cultivating engaging and forward-thinking diversity and inclusion programming, including the annual Inclusion Conference and Ignite, a program for racial equity action planning. Jejuana also develops and leads workshops as well as presents at conferences on topics including board diversity, inclusive leadership, and equity and inclusion in the workplace. Before joining GCP, Jejuana managed strategic projects and relationships for several departments at Cleveland State University. An active community member, Jejuana serves on the board and is chair of the governance committee for the Domestic Violence and Child Advocacy Center and is a member of the Alumni Advisory Committee for the Cleveland Leadership Center. She holds a Bachelor of Nonprofit Administration, a Master of Education in Adult Learning and Development, and a graduate certificate in diversity management from CSU. So welcome, Jejuana. Nicholas J. Gorris, PE, is a deputy county engineer at the Geauga County Engineer's Office with more than 25 years of experience, the last 8 working with the Geauga County Engineer for the residents of Geauga County. Before joining the county engineer, his experience was on the consultant side, designing and implementing simple roadway projects, traffic safety studies, ADA improvements, traffic signal design, utility infrastructure improvements, complete infrastructure replacements for the Army Corps of Engineers, to major reconstruction and complete interstate and interchange designs. His more recent experience in line with today's topic, just a minute. In line with today's topic is his teamwork with community stakeholders on the update to and implementation of the Geauga County Amish Safety Strategic Plan. Nick earned a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and a certificate in surveying from the University of Akron. Prior to his pursuit of an engineering degree, Nick studied architecture and construction technologies at Kent State University. So our next panelist is Joyce Huang, who is the Vice President of Community Development at Midtown Cleveland, Inc., a 501c3 economic and community development organization that serves the area between downtown Cleveland and University Circle. In her role with Midtown, she approaches urban planning, community development, and placekeeping efforts with an interdisciplinary and innovative mindset. She strongly believes that racial equity and belonging should undergird planning, real estate, and place-based efforts. Joyce holds a Master of Urban Planning, Design, and Development from Cleveland State University's Levin College of Urban Affairs and a BS in Sociology from the University of Michigan. She is the recipient of the 2020 Crain's Cleveland 40 Under 40 Award and the 2019 YWCA's Distinguished Young Woman Award. Her board involvement includes organizations like Building Hope in the City, the Cleveland Asian Festival, and the Design Review Committee by the City of Cleveland Planning Commission's region. So rounding out our panel is Richard Huang, who is an architect and has been the planning director for Cleveland Heights since 1994, where he's helping plan for a sustainable future through infrastructure modifications, zoning regulations, and public education. Richard can be seen smiling each day on his bike to work and around town, not because it's healthy, financially prudent, or good for the environment, but because it's fun. So Richard's last ride to work will be on November 13th because he'll be retiring that day after 39 years of public service. So congratulations, Richard. And I can say as a Cleveland Heights resident, we're truly gonna miss you there. And welcome to all our panelists. So before I pose the first question, let me mention to anyone in the audience that if you have a question, you can type it in the chat function. And if we have time, we'll go to those questions toward the end. So let's get started. So what does equity mean to each of you, and why is it important? Let's go alphabetically by first name, starting with Jejuana. There we go.
You know what? Equity means to me is that it acknowledges that we are all human, and that this is the base in which we will engage with each other. So it provides a platform from which to recognize the other person, recognize what they bring to the table. And that I think is very important, especially in these times.
Okay, thank you, Jejuana. Okay, Joyce, you're next alphabetically.
All right, thanks, Gail, and thanks everyone for allowing me to share with you. So, for me, I have a few comments about this, and I'd like to actually borrow from Midtown's recent racial equity statement. And so, from my perspective, if we're really thinking about urban areas, that the primary lens around equity needs to be around race and racial equity, and hopefully, those of you on the call are familiar with the huge disparities within different communities, specifically white and Black communities. And so I think for us, the frame that we really like is that racial equity is both an outcome and a process. So an outcome being when race no longer predicts someone's life outcomes. And I think from a planning standpoint, this can look like when structural issues around infrastructure and land use, create more connectedness, and also, decrease the disadvantages that certain communities face. From a process standpoint, our framework around this is really holistic. And so thinking about what does it mean not just to reconnect people physically to opportunities and better outcomes, but what does it mean to connect people in community and also psychologically? So that could look like reconnecting communities through relationship building. It could mean building and designing inclusive spaces that promote economic opportunity. And then I think there's also an element of acknowledging that there is trauma. There's generational trauma from being disconnected and being isolated from various opportunities from a healthy from health and well-being as an overall community. So the last thing I'll say is that I think equity, oftentimes we think of it as a very theoretical or conceptual concept, but I think that it's the strongest when it's personal. And I think for me, it is personal, and it's becoming more and more personal. And that sort of is what drives me and our organization in that practice. So.
Thank you, Joyce. Nelson?
Good afternoon, everyone. And it's an honor to be on this panel, and I love sharing time and space with my sister Joyce. Just always a fan of what's happening in and around Huff and Midtown. And as always, their CDC is at the bleeding edge of this. And I'll just riff on a couple of things. Well, one thing she said that I think is very profound. I think it's the definition I have of equity is power, and it's also the power to change your reality. Stop there.
Okay, thank you, Nelson. Okay, Nick?
Thank you, everyone. Equity is simple for me, I think. When you look at it from a standpoint of, I'll just use roadways. Everybody has access to these roadways or access to transportation, but equity is making sure that everybody can safely use it. It's not so much if we all get equal parts of something, but being able to actually utilize it safely, efficiently, and that everybody has the same result of utilizing that element of what we do.
Okay, thank you, Nick. And Richard?
Hey, Gail, I just realized even if you use last names, I'd still go last.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. We'll go with middle names next time. For equity, I was just breaking it down into 2 words. Everybody thrives. And here's a parent's recollection. When my kids were in the elementary school in Cleveland Heights, the public teachers didn't give them accelerated material to do during class. So if they mastered their lesson, the teachers got them to help classmates who were behind in their lessons. I had no clue how that shaped our kids' growth so they would be better rounded humans who understood equity at a young age and how everybody thrives.
Oh, thank you. So let's move on to our next question. Does there seem to be a greater focus on equity in planning now than in the past? And if there is, why do you think the shift has come about? Let's start with Nelson, who has some slides.
Great. Thank you. And I just want to call out in the beginning when you mentioned the bios. Hopefully many of you picked up that I'm not a planner. I'm not trained as a planner, but I sometimes use some of your language. So can you maybe pull up that slide? So I think, again, back to my answer, what equity is. Equity is knowing you have power and agencies actually using that power to change your reality. And it gives me a lot of pride to work for an organization that was started in 1914 and, had this vision to, pool resources of people with wealth. And I'll say this, the founders realized that they had power. These were powerful, rich white guys, bankers, lawyers that realized when that they had juice. So they got together and they pooled resources. And the vision was an equitable vision from the very beginning. This was our mission statement in 1914, to pool resources, I'll name it money, to fund charitable purposes for the mental, moral, and physical improvement of the people of Cleveland. And those last three words, again, I think rings throughout this talk, regardless of race, class, or creed, and how powerful it was to say that in 1914. So back to my original question, equity is about power and using that power for to help all.
Did you want me to advance to your next slide?
Sure, I could connect it. And the other part, again, back to my early definition, is the ability to change your reality. Before the foundation made its first grant, again, in the early 1900s, we looked at three issues affecting the lived experience of Clevelanders. We looked at, again, 1914, 15, 16, we looked at underperforming public schools, crime and public safety, and recreation. And I'll zero in on recreation. And it was this idea that every Cleveland kid, regardless of socioeconomic status, should have a flip and swing to play on, right? And our very first grant was to keep playgrounds open. Again, in the early 1900s. So it's this idea that, and the thrust behind this study was, again, in the early 1900s, only individual with means could actually go to a health club or, go on vacation and actually, experience nature. And this idea that, how do we make that equitable? Now, and with this last thing, this report is available online, and this report called out the poor quality of parks on the southeast side of Cleveland. Something we're still dealing with today. I'll stop there.
Okay. Richard, I think you had something else you wanted to add for this question.
Oh, there are a couple things. City Hall sent every employee to equity training, and I don't know if other cities are doing that, but they should, to sensitize their staff to the importance of equity. I don't know how the shift has come about, but it's overdue.
Okay, anyone else? Joyce?
Yeah, from the perspective in the city of Cleveland, we've seen an astounding amount of real estate investment over the past 10 or so years. And in Midtown, we've seen probably over 300 million in the last 3 to 5 years along the Health Line. But what is so discouraging and so real is that despite all of this investment and despite new buildings going up and infrastructure projects, that we still have this tale of two Clevelands that we see. And I think that is an essential truth that we really need to sit in, that no amount of sort of bringing back the tax base until we address that there are communities, specifically Black communities and other communities of color, that have been disadvantaged through things like planning, things through policy and redlining, that we need to really strengthen our urban core. And until then, we can't really move forward, because we see this divide, despite this investment, continue to grow and the disparity continue to grow. And so I think we're really at a pressure point right now where it's in the news. We've seen the reality of how humans are being treated, you know, whether it's based on your skin color and sort of the violence against people who are Black and brown. And so it's very top of mind, but I think it's been a long time coming, something that has been ingrained in our physical infrastructure and planning and other systems for generations. So it's really essential that we start to address it now.
Okay, thank you. Jejuana?
So building upon what the rest of my colleagues have said, one of the things that stands out to me is that disparity studies and research metrics such as the social determinants of health are being used now with government, with health officials, as well as Chamber of Commerce's. We are all very focused on that connection between the environment as well as the health and success, as well as the prosperity of our community. And when you start to look at economic inclusion and how, you know, Cleveland has a large Black population, but they're at the bottom of a lot of the statistics that are out there, you start to connect these dots with the actual environment in which they live. And I think that in turn starts to reflect in the planning that is coming about. As an urban planner, you begin to look at the viability of the neighborhoods. You know, Midtown is a great example. Even First Year Cleveland, the program that looks at the death rate of Black babies. And then you have, with that death rate being highly concentrated and high in the Huff area, what was a response? A response was for university hospitals to build the Women's Center right in the area. And so that, to me, is an example of equity in planning. They're trying to bring parity to an issue by solving it, by influencing the environment in which the people, the community where they live. And as everyone knows, I am not a planner, so.
So Nick, do you have anything to add?
Simple, you know, being an engineer, and a lot of my responses today are going to be based on engineering principles or transportation, because that's what I do. I think, you know, there is a greater focus. And for us, you know, as engineers, we're seeing, you know, the need to make sure, again, everybody, you know, it can access, and everybody has a means to safely travel through on these roads, whether it's the Amish community, whether it's bicyclists, whether it's cars, you know, pedestrians just walking. And I think our designs and everything that we're looking into is trying to ensure that we have the ability, you know, the safety, we're looking forward to make sure that in the future, even if we can't do it now, that we're able to do it later when maybe financials are available or the need arises. You know, in the rural community, we don't have, you know, we have more bicyclists, but we're not on sidewalks. We don't have as many pedestrians, but providing the additional shoulder. So I think in our designs, I believe in our designs, we are accounting for that more now, you know, as we move forward and go forward or in the future.
Okay, thank you. So how can planners and engineers help ensure that all people benefit from projects, including those who are in poverty and those who are underserved? Who'd like to start? Nick?
Just a quick comment.
Okay.
It's really up to you. This is for municipal planners mostly, although I said for Nick's purposes, for about 20 years, I'm not a planner, but I'm an architect. It's up to you to pick areas where the greatest need exists. rather than, and this is for the municipal planners, rather than the squeaky wheel that keeps calling you and hammering you on something when you ultimately know that's not the right place for you to spend your time and energy and resources.
Anybody else want to add to?
If we're talking in regards to, benefits, providing, ensuring that all are included, you have to go to your community. Reach out to them. We can design all we want, we can plan all we want, but if we don't include, and that was said before, including, if we don't include everybody or go out, we'll call them the people, we don't know what their needs are. We don't know how to design for that. We don't know how to plan for that, because we're not sure that that was their need. We don't know that was their need. So for me, reaching out, for everybody, reaching out and going to them is what we did at the Amish community. We actually went to their homes and found their safety committee and sat down with them numerous times just to start a conversation to say, hey, can you do this? We'll do this. It was a back and forth, and we learned a lot from that.
Thank you.
Gail,
Yes.
one thing I'll add too, it's about language, and I want to, again, shout out my other colleagues who named it, and I'm correcting myself when I said and to name things. For example, in my remarks, I mentioned this 1900 study referenced the southeast side of Cleveland. Really, the words they used were the Negro areas of Cleveland, and these neighborhoods are Black neighborhoods. So I just want to highlight, my misuse of words. And I think at the flip side, the other side of that is, in our world, professionals, I do that in air quotes, we weaponize our language. There are ways we could describe our work that lets the residents know who are the experts. So I think we have to maybe use more layman's terms to get our point across. It brings more people into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think also that there should be a respect for the community and what the community brings to the planning process. These people, the community members have lived in the community. They understand the nuances of why certain buildings are relevant, why certain corners should remain, why certain houses should be preserved. They understand the intersections, those cultural norms that they have built and honed day in and day out, because they have worked together. They're living together. They are building the community. And when someone from the outside comes in to offer assistance, I think that it needs to be with a respect that this is a shared experience. This is a shared process, recognizing that the community, while they may not have some of the education and some of the certifications, but they do bring their own level of expertise to a project and can definitely help to bring equity to the project.
Good points. Anybody else want to weigh in?
Jejuana, you hit the nail on the head. These are not, when I say we do a plan, we don't do a plan, we do someone else's plan. It's the neighborhood's plan. It's not our plan. It's for them. We're public servants. If we aren't serving them, who are we serving? So hats off to the non-planner.
Absolutely. I know, Jejuana, you're saying, I'm not a planner. But I mean, that is exactly their perspective around the reframing that needs to happen around public engagement. And actually, this segues well into the next question, which is around, how do you involve community residents, especially during a time of COVID? I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to thinking about this being a shared experience. Oftentimes consultants and planners are coming in as the expert, and what we have been trying to reframe at Midtown is who is also the expert. It's the person with the lived experience, and oftentimes the traditional community engagement or public engagement format doesn't allow for that. it's often community telling, right? So it's a traditional gathering where everyone comes to one room and the so-called hired experts, consultants share out information, maybe get a few pieces of feedback, but oftentimes it's ideas and concepts that have already been preformed or baked. And then you expect the community to tell you right back, like yes or no, and feedback here and there. And I think the community telling model leads to more distrust and leads to more chaos even during the planning process, because we're not really hitting the nail on the head on the issues that really matter to community members. And so something that we have really been thinking about is how do we pursue community engagement that really respects, like Jejuana said, the residents. And I think if you could go to the slides that I had pulled up, I think some good examples come from a recent TLCI update around East 66th Street, which was an update to a NOACA TLCI. And I think one of the things that was really important to our team in this process was that, much of the existing formats around community engagement is very transactional. So again, the telling, you tell me, I tell you. And what we really wanted to do was something transformational that would sort of transcend just, the individual with the so-called expert, but we wanted to see people actually be reconnected again within their communities. So the community building was not just with the community member and the planner, but it was community members among one another, as well as with the team that was gathering all this information and trying to come up with an infrastructure plan. So if you go to the next slide, I think during COVID, this ended up being a big challenge because we thought, we couldn't gather everyone into the same room. But what ended up happening was that we ended up hosting Zoom meetings that were reframed. This was reframed as a virtual block party as an introduction to this project. And we had several multidisciplinary folks on our team, including someone who is both a social worker and a choreographer. And so her approach towards this was, let's make it a real block party. Let's play music. Let's do movement and kind of loosen everyone up, get everyone both engaged with their mind and body. And if you can go to the next slide, this re-engaged people with their neighbors that they had not physically seen in a while, or maybe had never even met. And this produced this platform towards deeper conversations, which we called kitchen table conversations, meant to be intimate conversations about your community, about your dream for your neighborhood, and sort of irrelevant to a family, right? A family sitting down at the kitchen table and hashing it out. If you can go to the next slide, you'll see that we asked some questions around what does power mean, who has power in the neighborhood, and how can then we accomplish our vision, talking about these important themes. And I did see that Ron Calhoun put a question in the chat around how do we make this grassroots? And I think the conclusion from this actually ended up being that there were resident councils and youth councils that formed out of this engagement that were deeply invested in their own communities, wanted to see projects happen and wants to see this project happen. And if you can go to the last slide, you'll see just a showing of who was in the room. And what was amazing about Zoom, despite some of the digital connectivity, we had to get people used to Zoom and used to connecting. And Daniel Gray Kantar, who is one of our team members, said it well. He said, even though there's this digital connection, you're not asking people to come to you in a space that they're not familiar with terminology that might be new to them, and this mental and psychological feeling that I have to act a certain way or perform a certain way. But you could just be you. You could be watching your grandkid, you could be at the grocery store, yet still involved in this. And so we were just really excited about all the community building that's been happening, and much of it is due to the credit of the residents. And I'm being very long-winded, but my final thought, if you can go back to the first slide, is that we had a multiracial, multidisciplinary team. And this is an important point in that if we want to do equitable public engagement, sometimes the person leading the engagement might not be you. And it wasn't me. It wasn't me. We had people on our team who were better gifted, could speak the language of the community and translate these planning and infrastructure project and vision terminology. And I think sometimes it just means you might have to step aside. And I think that's something that we're continuously wrestling with in order to make sure that the community is the one that really gets the say.
Thank you, Joyce. So let me open this question up to the rest of the panelists. How do the rest of you engage and involve community residents in the planning process? And, like Joyce said, you have to go beyond just the traditional public meeting. So what other tools and media and outreach mechanism and process have the rest of you used?
So I have two examples, and they just happen to be, again, stuff coming out of Midtown Shop, and just again the idea of that they're always willing to collaborate. We did a project with Neighborhood Connections. Again, this notion of people cannot gather, so we had 2 virtual town halls on actually 2 topics, 4 sessions, and back to how we use language. One was on transportation mobility, and we decided to kind of to make the explanation of the session a little more relatable. We asked a question: how have you been moving around during COVID-19? We didn't ask them to say, what have been your transportation options? How have you been moving around? And we reached out to Midtown, and they said, there's a group of Mandarin residents who want to be involved. And the realization that I had pre-COVID, it would probably been difficult to have that meeting with a breakout of Mandarin, but on Zoom, we were able to put them into a virtual room. They have dialogue and then a translator report back. And it was a very powerful experience for me to see that happen, because I felt as though I was, part of a conversation normally that I wouldn't be a part of. And the second thing, I'll put in the Zoom chat. We partner with an organization called Seventh Hill, and the principal is David Jerka, who does some really smart work around urban design, and he's pulled us into the augmented reality, virtual reality world. And again, the idea was, we can't go to conferences, we can't do neighborhood tours. How do we replicate that? And again, I reached out to Midtown and asked Joy, would she be open to experimenting with this 360 virtual tour of Huff and Midtown? And if you play with this, you make a click, to the top right is a scroll. So you as an individual could scroll the vantage point of the camera. So you're not forced to see this one-dimensional view. And Joyce did this wonderful, Joy did this wonderful walking tour of Euclid, talking about what will be the hopes and dreams of residents. And it was I should have recorded it, I didn't, but it was actually beautiful. And again, this to me is a tool to bring people into a place and have them experience it on their own terms. The potential behind this, I think it's something that the planning world and other nonprofits should embrace. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nelson. Anybody else want to contribute? Okay, well, let's go on to our next question. Can you give us some examples? This is kind of a long question with multi questions involved. Can you give us some examples of projects where you specifically engaged segments of a community? And how did you identify the population segments that you wanted to ensure were included? And how did you engage them? What was the outcome? And what tools did you use in your planning process that others could replicate? And what were some of the difficulties? Who'd like to start with this one? I think I'll start with Richard, because Richard has some slides. Let me advance.
Thanks, Gail. Yeah, what you're looking at is Compton Road. And maybe 10 years ago, it would have been a very unlikely TLCI-like project, but we chose Compton because it was so hard hit from the foreclosure crisis. It's got low income, it's got minority, it's got people that are traditionally excluded from all of this good city services that we pour on more promising neighborhoods. So demolished sites are on every side street of Compton, and the households are largely low income. We closed the street. You see how there's those little cones in the road. We closed the street. We got sidewalk chalk for kids, and we had sort of a block party where we led the Compton residents down their street, asking them for ideas to rethink their roads use. You go on to the next slide. Of course, it was, I think, 90+ degrees. It was in the middle of summer, but nonetheless, they were out there in comfortable clothes, and we hoped that they could visualize ways to look at their roads. And we gave them a handout, just like a primer on ideas that they could use to rethink their road. If you're familiar with Dutch Wooners, where it's a road that's a living room right in the street, where cars feel like they have to tiptoe around kids wandering, playing, feeling like it is their part of their property. I think there's one other slide. And so we led them on this tour and took them the full length of the site and got good input from them on that day.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Does anyone else have some examples?
I think with in Geauga County with the Amish community, and I'm going to focus on that because that's where we had really great engagement. But the Amish community isn't a digital community. They don't have email. They don't really get on the web page. In fact, we did a strategic plan update, and in order to reach out, we sent out 1,200 surveys. But we had to get the addresses, and it was a book. They have an address book that they update, but they update it with the manual typewriter. So we had to take all that information. We typed it in digitally, the team typed it in, and we submitted it. We received 40% response from the Amish community on all of that. We had almost 800 responses come back from the community because we engaged them. We spoke with their safety committee and said, hey, we need your help because what we're planning here is to help your community, to help you. So we didn't have the digital, we couldn't do a Zoom. We didn't do, postings of emails. We had to actually knock on doors and do mailings, and we sent out more mailings, and with the help of their community and their monthly newspaper that they send out that's manually typed, we got the responses. It was great.
Wow, thanks, Nick. Anybody else?
I can speak a little bit about folks that don't have English as their first language. And so we work with the Asiatown community, which is just north of Midtown. And we have an amazing project manager and a community organizer who specifically speaks Mandarin Chinese, but also can understand Cantonese. And it is a multilingual community, so there are many different dialects and languages spoken. But what was really important was that they are not on the traditional sort of Zoom and Facebook digital platforms. They're on WeChat. And so Xin Yuan, who is our community organizer, had spent a lot of time engaging folks through WeChat to just put out information, communicate, and translate everything that was out there. But one thing that we came across as we started to do some, community meetings and to engage folks was that there was a big challenge around thinking about the future. For folks who have been really strapped, whether it was limited resources or time or just in their daily grind, the future is not something that's sort of like something they can put into words often. They're like, I need to focus on today and I need to focus on getting through tomorrow. And so the approach that we've been taking for our strategic planning process and strategic visioning process is through the form of narrative and storytelling. And a lot of it is around, tell us about someone who is important to you and what values they imparted to you. And instead of thinking about the future with, many Chinese and Asian families being, filled with filial piety and thinking about family, it's not, what are some future uses that you would want to do in the neighborhood, but what do you want your great grandchildren to experience, and really framing it in that sense. And we had folks do one-on-one interviews with one another to build that community and reconnect folks, and then also draw out all those narratives. And so I will leave it at that.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, let's go on to our next question then, which Joyce kind of laid the groundwork for. Sometimes projects involve stakeholders from insular religious groups, or people whose first language is not English, as Joyce mentioned, or some other tight-knit group. So can you talk about strategies that you've used to engage those types of groups to ensure that they're included in the planning process? And if it's the custom in some of those groups for the men to communicate with other men, how do you engage the women? And I think Richard has some slides. So I'll let Richard go first.
Yeah, I don't know if Katie and Melissa from NOACA are on this, but the TLCI study on Taylor Road is just burned into my head. I never forget this night meeting. I think there were 3 night meetings just like this, and they just kept at it, where the Orthodox Jewish community is so tight knit, and the men just huddled like they were in a huddle, and the women couldn't break into that huddle. There was a place for them, but it wasn't right there literally at the table where decisions were being made between the guys. And so one of the things you notice in the slide was there's a guy in a car repair shirt. He's one of the leading business people in the community, Baruch Taub. And when he opens his mouth, people listen. So we zeroed in on people like that. And Katie wisely realized you've got to present the data to Baruch and convince him. And we took him over to an illustration board showing the frequency of crashes and so on and so forth. Just to impress on him. After 3 meetings, we won him over from, well, there's just not there. Forget about the idea of bike lanes. Forget about no one walks in my Orthodox community and things like that, to, oh, maybe the road could be rethought from the way it is now. You go to the next slide. And you can see at the same table, though, over time, a persistent woman who was Orthodox and who had her back literally to the wall in the corner, was a wallflower, moved up to the table, because we provided that opportunity with a small group discussion that you don't get with that big meeting, where she would never just raise her hand and just go ahead and say something when her husband was there. But in this case, she was talking to Katie and me all about her thoughts, which were totally different than the husband's sitting around the table.
Okay. Anyone else?
One example of, actually 2 short examples of a group not in the planning world that communicates or works with different populations, non-English speaking populations, is Refugee Response. They're a resettlement agency here in Cleveland. And they learned that, when the Bhutanese or folks from other Asian or African countries come to Cleveland, that when they need to communicate, government policies, rules and regulations, that the traditional way of a memo and a text or an email doesn't work. So what they do is they use short videos to tell a story or to explain a policy. They partnered with us around the census, and I'll include it in the chat. They put together these, minute and a half commercials where you could layer on different languages that tell the importance of the census. Another example of a project is Making Our Own Space, Kent State Urban Design Collaborative. It's a project that involves young people in urban design and planning. I think the beautiful part about this project is that it understands young people, that we can't expect them to sit in a room and just reference plans, that it's a very tactile work. So they actually build stuff, they prototype, they use hammers, they use nails, they use power tools. And I think that's another way of introducing engaging people, involving other senses, is the short answer.
I love that. I love moves. And the fact that youth are involved from the very beginning, from the design standpoint, and get to build it is amazing. And we draw inspiration from that in our Asiatown strategic vision. We also provided folks not only the ability or the platform to share narrative, but we worked with Upcycle Part Shop to provide art kits for people who wanted to represent their dreams and vision or wishes through arts. And so some kids did it. I think some seniors are probably going to be working on it too. And the idea came from the fact that, you know, we're all still somewhat isolated, very isolated, given the pandemic, and to be able to share just with a different discipline or format.
So, great suggestions. Anybody else? Okay, let me pose another question. How do you engage with people or groups that aren't like you and may not want to hear what you have to say, either because of their own biases or because you're different or because you're asking uncomfortable questions, which may be uncomfortable for both you and them?
Gail, I'll start off there. You know, in the context of difference, I've always found it helpful to acknowledge the elephant in the room. You know, if you try to slide in, you usually are sliding out. But if you want to like stop on base, then you need to acknowledge that we're at a baseball field, and these are, you know, this is the tension in the room. Here are some reasons why. I realize that I'm different or that I may have a different experience from you, but here are some additional reasons that you may not be aware of why I am invested in seeing the success of this project. And so being very clear about your intentions, staying true to your word, and acknowledging when you can and when you cannot do something. I think all of those things contribute to building trust. And the more that you continue to build off of that trust, then you're able to have those difficult conversations with people, and people realize that we're trying to get to a solution. You're not trying to attack the way that a person thinks or criticize what they think. It's purely out of here is a need. We want to work with you to best solve this need. So, and I'm the person to help you do it, whether you want me or not.
Okay, thank you.
I have a smart aleck answer for that. I would say, again, you know, us experts, the professionals, you know, the planners, it's not about our comfort. So if the conversation gets uncomfortable, okay. So, yeah, it's not.
Are we so fragile? Are we so fragile?
Right. I mean, it's, you know, as Nelson said, I mean, our comfort is secondary. Really, we just want to be able to gain the trust of the people who we are working with. And whether it is, I mean, I have uncomfortable conversations all the time. And when I'm in those conversations, it's a different Jejuana. And then when I go home, I'm like, can you believe blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I can download and then kind of unpack. Well, I can see why. And then it helps me to be able to go back in, even if it continues to still be uncomfortable. I have to keep my eye on what is most important here, and it's not necessarily my comfort. Now, disrespect is something very different. That's a different conversation, you know, where you have to establish just what your ground rules are regarding that. But comfort, you know, we can get around that.
And I'm also, thank you, Joyce. I'm also going to use this opportunity to send some, you know, shout and love and respect to the CDC sector, because of all of the nonprofits. CDCs have an immediate proximity to residents, and I still have memories of residents yelling at me, and then I seeing them. It's Sunday in the grocery store, and then by Tuesday they're asking me how my kid's doing. So if you work in, you know, let's say a policy organization, you are very, very much removed from the people you're trying to serve. So I think, again, the CDCs, the settlement houses, the users come in, call us on our shit every day. And I think it keeps the work honest and authentic.
Nelson, it's debatable if CDCs truly are the most proximate to residents. I think that's something our industry could work on more and more. But I think, you know, just to add 2 cents is that, you know, if we're really talking about a community that has been historically marginalized, and I'm not talking about squeaky wheels who show up to every meeting, but communities that have been historically marginalized, then maybe we need to listen, right? Because even if it's uncomfortable, there's a reason why there might be a lot of emotion or it might be a lot of thoughts, because there hasn't been that space to really talk. And as a culture, just broad mainstream culture in the United States, we're not good with discomfort. And what Jejuana said about acknowledging it is sort of like a basic psychological thing where when we acknowledge our discomfort and allow it to, you know, not place any judgment necessarily in the discomfort, but by acknowledging it, we sort of sit in the truth and the experience and then allow that feeling to pass and then continue to build trust rather than stuffing it down and making it numb and then having that sort of distrust or discomfort persist. So.
Okay. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go to the next question. And Nelson has some slides on this one. So planners often work on multidisciplinary teams when they're responsible for leading public engagement efforts. So what are some of the strategies that you use to engage the whole team that's involved to get them involved in public engagement and so that the results are meaningfully incorporated into technical plans and products? So we'll start with Nelson, who has some slides. Nelson, are you still there?
And yeah, so part of the reaction I had with that question, again, it's about come out a different way. In most Black and Brown and Asian communities, we do this thing called code switching, where there's a certain way you have to act depending on the audience you're in. So I'm saying, again, specific to planners, when I read that question, I'm like, it's really not about the community to help with your deliverables or your products. So you probably have to say that to a funder or your client. I think for the residents, back to what many people have said on this process, you have to connect your work and your resources to their lived experience. And another way, again, is to raise up the benefits. And I'll reference this. So the RAND Corporation, along with City Parks Alliance, this report, please check it out. They asked this question that the neighborhood park is a public health intervention. All the bad stuff affecting Black communities, you see it there. It could be addressed by physical activities, but many of these neighborhood parks are of poor quality. Again, a planner, you know, is this in the toolkit of a planner? They think about, you know, how kids get their moderate to vigorous physical activity to address, you know, health issues. And if you go to the next slide, and I'll kind of end with this. So, you know, the foundation's been around over 100 years. We tried a lot, we're doing a lot of big initiatives. And my colleague and I, Keisha Gonzalez, we reviewed the work and, you know, we wanted to say we have a framework. And it's really, in every neighborhood, there's 3 things: people, place, and power. Many of us have been talking about this already. So what we say is, how do we use our resources to improve the lived experience of people? And how do we strengthen the social fabric in meaningful ways? And then, you know, place, you know, we're talking about this in this call, but the benefits, how do we use it to make people happier and healthier and richer? And then power has been, you know, a theme throughout this talk. And it's really about individuals in the neighborhood holding people like us on this call accountable. And if you look at that photo, I stare at this photo a lot. And this was a project, a block party in the Britt Oval neighborhood, and Land Studio had these images of, you know, what features of a park, and these kids got to vote. And when we were talking to this kid, his chest swelled. He's like, "You're asking me?" And again, I take a lot of pride. You go by that park today, it's done. Britt Oval Park is done. So it's about, you know, how are we using our resources to, how do we share in our power, I guess is my short answer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anybody else? Okay. We are running at 1 o'clock in a couple minutes, but I'm just going to ask a really quick question. Most of the chat room things were comments, so rather than questions. So I'm going to ask one final question real quickly and then wrap up. What would each of you like the audience to take away from today's event? So do you want to go alphabetically? Jejuana, do you want to start?
Sure. I think the takeaway that I want people to leave with is that we are not alone and we cannot do these things alone, whether it is especially within our respective communities. And so collaboration is crucial to any equity planning.
Thank you. Joyce?
Sure. So I have two thoughts. Rethink what public engagement looks like, and make sure it's not siloed in, but continuously weave it into your process. And my second one is that equity issues exist in systems. And so when we're building out planning teams, and this is part of the East 66th Street team, is that we didn't only have the technical folks, but we had someone who was both a social worker and an artist, a choreographer. And we also had an educator who works with youth, who is also a poet. And these different angles, like, really just worked well with the community we're working with. And, we need to start thinking more holistically rather than in just one specific discipline.
Thank you. Okay, Nelson?
And I feel like, I'm on this panel with some really smart people. I think we're all saying the same thing. I would say when you focus on place, you do everything differently. And I stole that from Fred Kent from Project Public Spaces, so it's not my original quote. I'll just say that.
Okay, Nick?
I think the biggest takeaway, just using a little bit of what everybody said today, let's go to the experts, take the planners and engineers and all other leaders in these panels, and let's go to the experts and listen, acknowledge, engage. And I think, Richard, you said it best. Let's make it so that everybody thrives.
Okay. And then that leads into Richard. What do you want people to take away from this?
Well, the most important thing is you break it down and you approach a person with a warm heart. You really want to help them. I think the first tool you use is not your mouth, but your ears. You figure out what they want, what's important to them. And I think every panelist talked about that. What is important to them should be in your plan.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, we are out of time, so I thank you all for your informative discussion. It was fascinating. I learned a lot. And I thank, our audience for tuning in. And I hope you all found this as interesting as I did. And I'll just give a little plug for our next Lunch and Learn next month. It is on Thursday, November 19th, and we'll be talking about crosstalk, engineer speak, and planner speak for better understanding and collaboration. And the speakers that day will be Nancy Lyons-Stadler, who is the Cleveland office lead at WSP, a consultant; Caitlin Milius, a city planner in the Department of Planning and Development at the City of Lakewood; Alex Pesta, a principal of city architecture, and I saw him in one of Joyce's pictures; and Eva Vargas, who's the project engineer in the mayor's office of capital projects, the division of engineering and construction for the city of Cleveland. So you can register for this event on Eventbrite. And until then, take care and plan on. Thank you very much to everybody.